Thank you so much. This is such a treat to be in Greece in the school year, and also to have such an incredible audience. Usually, when I give talks, I have to say, "Okay, there's this island called Lesbos, in this part of the map," and I gladly don't have to give those introductions. But first of all, I just want to say that this is a very new project, and it's in many ways a response to obviously the recent refugee crisis. So it will not have a kind of a good synthetical moment for you. It will be a little scattered. I will present to you 4 different projects and sneaking in a couple of other ones. Because ultimately, I think the archaeology of migration more broadly is something that has been sort of occupying my energy and my fieldwork. Before I start, I also want to say very thanks to a number of people behind the scenes that have been sort of my informers and my assistants in trying to sort of deal with the refugee crisis in Greece from as far away as Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And those include Yannis Hamilakis and Katerina Rozakou for their intellectual challenges, Karen Emmerich and Stephanie Larson for their contribution from on the ground, Joanna Kakissis as the voice of Greece for us listening to NPR every morning, Randy Maguire, Karen Van Dyke, and Jason De Leon on the Mexican migrant front, Bill Carher, Richard Rothaus on the North Dakota front, Todd Brenningmeyer and Miltos Katsaros, who is here, my personal, my partners in fieldwork crime, I guess. But also I want to highlight a photographer named Kristen Redder, who back in Lancaster is holding an exhibition in our museum called Where Hope Finds Home, an ethnographic record of their refugees that have resettled in Lancaster. Many of you might know that Lancaster has the highest concentration of resettled refugees since the 70s around the world practically. And finally, I just want to say thank you to the Noel Baker family for allowing me to look at their archives, because ultimately I'm here to find connections between a very interesting diachronic side of long-term philanthropy. So thank you, everyone. Thank you. There's so many people here whom owe intellectual debts, and I'm overwhelmed just being here. I should say that also in translation between the US and Greece and between a Mac and a PC, crazy things has happened to my presentation, including the word landscape, but I didn't even bother to fix it because I know it's going to happen practically every slide, so it'll be part of the flavor, I guess, of the project. So, all right, let's see. July 15th, 2016, Syrian refugee camp in Katsikas, outside of Ioannina. 2 American students from Princeton University are doing humanitarian work inside with NGO Lighthouse Relief and their professor, Karen Emmerich. Outside, 2 American students from Franklin and Marshall College record the camp as a cultural landscape with their professors, myself, and Todd Brenningmeyer. We see gravel, a ball, dirt, weeds, impermanent housing, trees, and a barren hill in the distance. By cultural landscape here, we mean a slice of landscape that has been marked by human intervention, albeit ephemeral. The argument that I will make tonight is that archaeologists' job, the argument that I will make tonight is that the Greek countryside bears a horizontal stratigraphy of human suffering, and that the archaeologist's job and responsibility is to decipher it. July 15th, 1923, an unknown refugee family from Asia Minor takes a family portrait in front of their tent. We see the same landscape almost a century ago, whose human stories may have marked modern Greek identity, but whose materiality has really disappeared. If we can even find where this site is, we can only recover it archaeologically. But in Greece, excavating the recent past, even a past 100 years old, is a taboo. Greece contains one of the largest mass graves in Europe, yet nobody dares to excavate it, as has become standard for a form of forensic reconciliation in other European countries, especially Spain. So without an archaeology of modern Greeks in Greece, we must turn elsewhere to the archaeology of modern Greeks outside of Greece, such as in the field of historical archaeology in the United States, and particularly the excavations of Colorado's coal country. In 1914, a group of Greek migrants joined the strike against the Colorado Coal Company, owned by the Rockefeller family. Under the leadership of Louis Tikas, they built a tent city that you see here. The Colorado State militia broke the strike by opening fire and burning the striker camp. Oops, wrong button. As seen here in the Red Cross photograph, killing women and children and turning Tikas into an instant martyr of the American labor movement. The site was abandoned, but between 1997 and 2002, archaeologists Randy McGuire, Dean Saitas, and Philip Duke excavated the site and revealed the daily lives of a workers' camp. You see here the foundations of the tents and the rich material culture left behind that included the very objects that the migrants from Greece, Italy, Russia, and Mexico had brought from home, and the ones that, of course, didn't burn at the conflagration. The Ludlow excavations challenged many of our assumptions based on historical records alone, such as the role of women in acculturation or the role of housing in identity formation. Kostis Kourelis, of course, has arrived to similar conclusions about Greek women in textile manufacturing in his important new book, published in Greek, Red America. I introduce my talk today with American archaeology for many reasons. For one, it is a tradition that informs my work. For two, it is here that the notion of an archaeology of care was first presented at the 2017 annual meeting of the Society of Historical Archaeology in Dallas, Texas. More importantly, I contend that the archaeology of the Greek diaspora must play a central voice in the discourse of refugees in Greece, on the one hand, and over migration policy in the United States, on the other hand, particularly under the current administration. We must not forget that these Greek children, captured by the lens of social reformer Jacob Riis in 1904, were received with disdain. Their host society saw them as racially black and practically non-human. They were the subject of humanitarian aid and humanitarian research, as, for example, this study of Greek tenements in Chicago from 1910, which helped give birth to the methodologies of social science, namely the Chicago School of Sociology. This is from the Journal of American Sociology. As Tom Gallant in the audience knows more than anybody else, these Greeks were subject to violence and riots across Omaha, Nebraska to Toronto, Ontario. In a study of Philadelphia's Greektown, I have begun to explore how humanitarianism has shaped the Greek migrant experience. As a Quaker city, Philadelphia is a unique case study in its immigration response. Unlike all other cities in the U.S., Philadelphia prided itself on its liberal housing policy. Its housing association, as you see here in its 1904 map, mapped its ethnic ghettos and sought to eradicate migration problems through private home ownership. The Greek district, you can't really see it, it's just a very faint dot. That won't even bother, right over the big black zone. Was bordered by an African-American enclave to the south in black, the Jewish district to the east in yellow, and the Bohemian Arts District, now proudly called the Gayborhood, to the west. The first housing study of this area was done by no less figure than W.E. Du Bois, a major hero in African-American history, in his groundbreaking study of the Philadelphia Negro for his PhD thesis in sociology. Du Bois went door to door in 1899 and collected data for each house, and you can see he recorded levels of poverty and criminality. Philadelphia had the greatest immigrant home ownership than any city in the country, and for that matter in the world at the time, so much so that in the 1893 World's Fair, it presented its low-income housing module as its greatest achievement. You can see here the actual model that was used for the exhibition. After surveying Greek mountain villages that were built on remittances from the U.S., which I will talk about a little bit later on the right, a group of undergraduate students commenced an archaeological study of Greektown, Philadelphia's Greektown. The two students on the right, Lizzie and Cassie, on the right of the left picture, are the ones that also commenced the landscape study of Syrian refugee camps as well, and also a little project on a survey of a Cold War American housing camp for the Voice of America out in Kavala, but I will leave that out of the talk. Philadelphia's Greektown was centered around the Church of St. George, bought from the Episcopalians in 1922, as this photo with Bishop Alexander commemorates. Interestingly enough, 2 weeks before the Greek Orthodox Church even existed, for him to even be a bishop there at the center. Our team digitized archives from the Greek American Heritage Society housed in the third floor of the church rectory, a Frank Furness building on the left, including handwritten ledgers of baptisms, marriages, and funerals. Incidentally, the records include many Syrians that were in fact an integral part of the early community. We have transcribed the first 700 Greek-American babies from 1909 to 1929, which amazingly enough note the precise village of origin for fathers and godparents. And this is the beginning of that sort of database. We hope to really link them back home in some integral way. We also digitized the 1920 US Census and joined those tables with a contemporary map that you see here. And what you see here on this early mapping project is on the left, you see the houses occupied by Greeks. And on the right, you see houses that have survived the aggressive urban renewal in the 60s and gentrification in the 90s on the right in pink. I should also tell you that Greektown does not exist anymore. Like most Greek towns, it has completely disappeared, partially to all kinds of interesting things that happened in the 60s. In many ways, the slums that the Greeks created, they moved out of for the next group of economic migrants to occupy as they moved out to the suburbs. We have also triangulated the data with 580 photos from the city records and have images for many of the buildings that have been torn down through the urban renewal, kind of slum cleaning of the 1960s, such as this house, which on its first floor have the Cafe Neon Chios. The ultimate goal of this preliminary mapping is to excavate the backyards of the Greek houses and offer another view of the materialities of migration that the very tortured Ladlo massacre site will not give you. Here's an archaeology of well-being as opposed to an archaeology of suffering. But let's return to St. George. The church, originally St. Andrew, was Philadelphia's premier Episcopal church in the obvious Greek revival style of 1823. Its architect, John Haviland, whose portrait now hangs at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, is not only America's most important architect for the era, but was a member of the congregation and was in fact buried in the church's crypt. With his right hand on Stuart and Revette's Antiquities in Athens, his left shoulder touches a watercolor of the world's first humanitarian prison, not very classical at all, Eastern State Penitentiary that he designed. I'll show you a view of the same sanctuary, of the same space, as a Greek church today on the right, and as its Episcopal predecessor on the left, because it's from this pulpit that the Reverend Gregory Bedell initiated American humanitarianism to Greece. His sermon, The Cause of the Greeks, became the charter for humanitarian aid to Greece, which includes the first camp, refugee camp, built for, well, more properly, internally displaced camp, built for the Greeks during the Revolution. Samuel Howe, who served the Greek War of Independence as a medical doctor, managed the humanitarian relief sent from Bedell and Philadelphia in Greece on the ground. He assisted in the first orphanage built by Kapodistrias in Nafplion, at the first agricultural school built by Kapodistrias in the archaeological site of Tiryns, both turned into prisons very quickly. He founded, most importantly, the refugee town of Washingtonia in the vicinity of Hexamelia in Corinth. It is no coincidence that the British Philip Baker, recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, was sent to Philadelphia for college in 1905. Member of a Quaker family, he was sent to Haverford College, where, among other things, he ran track and field and even participated in the Olympics. The main reason, as I mentioned, that I am here with you today is thanks to the generosity of the British School at Athens that has tasked me with investigating the Noel Baker papers. The Noel estate at Ahmed Aga, or today's Prokopi, best represents the layered stratigraphy of humanitarianism in one location. The estate was founded in 1832 as an agricultural school, modeled on innovative self-sufficiency pedagogical reforms propagated by Howe, by Reverend Bedell, and most known, the Hills, John and Fanny Hill. But unlike the Hill School in Athens that survives today, the Noel School never got off the ground. However, the estate played an important second role in humanitarian history in 1925 as the site for a refugee camp for a group of Cappadocians. All right, I have lots to show you, and I will try to create a portrait of a response to what I've been describing as an archaeology of care with a focus on this layered landscape. What I hope to do, and do it as succinctly as I can, is show you in backward chronological order 4 projects that explore that layered landscape. A remote sensing project with current refugees, a project documenting internally displaced peoples from a World War II village from Leiki. Then I will talk a little bit about archaeologists' response to the last major Asia Minor refugee crisis. And then finally, I will return with an exploration of Washingtonia, take us right back to the beginning of the archaeology of humanitarianism. And you'll see, Philadelphia, America, Boston and Philadelphia mostly play a huge role here. And I think they're both important members of the equation, not because the Greeks ended up occupying the houses of these Philhellenes, worshipping in the churches of these Philhellenes. That is not a coincidence. It's because there is a continuity from the American side of a certain agenda, a Protestant agenda, an agenda that has an important component of doing good work globally as part of its religious and then political mission. Finally, I do some prospecting. I want to show you some jewels that I've discovered in my very few days, looking at boxes and boxes, really ultimately 2 boxes that I'd put my fingers through from the Noel Baker estate. And I will describe to you what this experimental school might have looked like in the 1820s, but I'll focus more for the correspondence in the 1920s. But let's get started. Part 1, undocumented migrant and refugee camps in Greece, the most recent crisis. According to the United Nations, 65.3 million people, 1 in every 113 citizens, like one in every 100 people in this globe, are refugees or internally displaced. This is not a small problem. This is not just a problem for 57 or 60,000 people. Some 5,000 of these drowned while crossing the Mediterranean Sea in 2016 alone, making it the deadliest year in history. Like dozens of archaeologists and students in 2015, I was carrying out my field work on deserted Greek villages, while thousands of refugees and undocumented migrants arrived daily at the beautiful islands of Lesbos, Chios, Samos, and Kos. The image of Aylan, the dead Kurdish boy washed on the Turkish coast, made carrying on with archaeology as usual an impossible proposition for me. I almost even couldn't take my students to the beach anymore. What follows was a sudden and incomplete shift of my research priorities, an ad hoc attempt to define this archaeology of care, a notion really that my good friend Bill Carher first coined on a blog spot. Now, I must say that Carher, Richard Brothas, and Brett Weber have already sort of spent 4 seasons in the oil fields of North Dakota mapping migrant worker camps. So both Carher, interestingly enough, both Carher and Rothhaus are students of Tim Gregory and members of the Eastern Corinthian Archaeological Survey. And in many important ways, the North Dakota Man Camp Project was nothing but a methodology developed by Tim and Lita Gregory in the Corinthia and then shifted over to the American Prairie. This experience of the North Dakota camps had already converted me to an archaeology of what's called the contemporary world, an important new discipline that studies the mobility of capital and labor and the informal urbanism that is dominating in habitation, a kind that we once associated with the developing world, but is clearly not the case anymore. But it's one thing to carry out an archaeology of a booming oil economy until the crash about a year ago, among the friendly people of the American Midwest, and another thing to carry out an archaeology of forced encampment among desperate people traumatized by war, loss of life, rape, exploitation, and with no foreseeable future in a Europe and a United States of closed doors and xenophobia. Unlike the migrant camps in North Dakota, moreover, refugee camps in Greece are inaccessible to fieldwork. Paradoxically, refugee camps have never been more accessible to distant viewers like me back in my office in Lancaster, thanks to constant reporting by journalists, NGOs, and by refugees themselves over social media, Facebook, Instagram. I use an example from Camp Softex in Thessaloniki, the abandoned toilet paper factory. A picture from National Geographic, not a minor journal, allows us to document the tents down to their construction details, record wheelchairs and laundry facilities, note the details on the far wall, in the distance, which we can then triangulate with an image of the same location by the New York Times that shows, of a different date, right, that shows how 3 Syrian boys improvise in baking pita bread. In some sense, the archaeological record is being produced virtually. Beyond the proliferation of images, material culture itself has played an important role in the representation of this crisis. Consider the installation of 2,500 life jackets from Chios laid out as graves in front of the British Parliament, or better known, Ai Weiwei's wrapping of Berlin's concert hall with life jackets from Lesbos. Even Doctors Without Borders took a material turn in their exhibition Forced from Home. As a visitor in the Philadelphia installation of the exhibition, I experienced a ride on an inflatable boat that was brought from Greece, a tent from Mogadishu, or a tent from France's infamous Calais jungle, just a few months before the real site was razed by the French government. Consider the challenges posed by this juxtaposition. An image of a refugee camp in Samos, like you probably see that on the left, and its trailers made by IKEA, by the way, against Independence Hall in the distance, where the Declaration of Independence was signed. The installation allowed you to enter reconstructed interiors that contained original artifacts in their precise locations, something that I cannot do in a refugee camp, or even if I could, I wouldn't ethically. Sorry. There's also, an archaeological ethos is also evident in projects by visual artists like George Butler, who drew artifact assemblages from refugee camps in Lebanon, which you see here, for example, right, and almost like an archaeological drawing. Or Oliver Kugler, you might know even better, who documented refugees in the public spaces of Chios for Harper's Magazine. You see the inventory at the lower right of refugees in the public spaces of Chios, where you have things like an inventory of cardboard boxes, trash, and tents distributed by Doctors Without Borders, mapped in detail by an artist. In his October 28 blog post, American archaeologist Paul Mullins, one of the most important historical archaeologists in the States, argued for the preservation and excavation of Calais jungle as a site of global heritage after it was destroyed. Humanitarian photographer Gideon Mendel took precisely such an approach by collecting surface garbage after the destruction of the site and photographing them systematically in his studio. You see, for example, a catalog of toothbrushes here and the ubiquitous teddy bear in the next image. Material culture has also been at the center of an ecological humanitarianism known as upcycling. With an estimated 600,000 plastic life jackets and 10,000 rubber boats strewn on the shores of Lesbos, the refugee crisis is an ecological consequence. Lighthouse Relief began a cleanup of the coast and then recycling or upcycling the rubber as raw materials for the crafting of accessories made by volunteers, such as this wallet here. And I also want to thank Anna Tarshan Larsen, who I think is here in the audience, for all the organization's generosity in helping me work through that material. As we know, the arrival of refugees in the Aegean reached crisis levels in the summer of 2015 as Greece's neighbors closed their borders and trapped 60,000 people in Greece. The EU struck a controversial treaty with Turkey mandating the arrest of each future arrival. The 60,000 refugees already landlocked became Greece's domestic problem. Bankrupt, as you know best, since 2007, and with its own internal humanitarian crisis of poverty and hunger, the Greek state was in no position to invest into a group whose main goal was to leave Greece as fast as possible. The crisis within a crisis was solved by a strategy of decentralization, or sharing the burden. The government effectively called up each province and asked them to find a feasible location for a camp. These camps were placed in land of no private value, because they'd have to be bought, right, but close enough to minimal amenities and sufficiently removed from populated centers to avoid tensions with the local population, Golden Dawn groups, and what have you. Although spread throughout Greece, all camps shared features of abandonment, namely decommissioned army bases, deserted factories, inactive airports, bankrupt resorts, vacant supermarkets, sports arenas, all sites of military and economic decline. And I will not speak today at all to the other sites, the self-managed sites or the hotspots on the islands. The refugees were forced into an archaeological environment of modern ruins. They inhabited the ruins, literally, the ruins of the economy, the ruins of modernity. These edge cities in the landscape became organic appendages to a failed nation state. How could we not deal with these as archaeologists? They are ruins, they're archaeological sites. They formed microcosmic borderlands between the global and the local, or compressed proxies of global conflict. In his archaeological survey of the Sonora Desert, through which Mexican migrants daily illegally cross into the United States, Jason De Leon has argued that the landscape becomes a central agent that passes ethical responsibility to the landscape in order to absolve us from that responsibility. Their suffering is not caused by us, but by the forces of nature. It is to De Leon's undocumented migration project that Greek archaeologists must find a precedent, a conversation, and indeed Yannis Hamilakis partnered with De Leon in co-chairing a session devoted to the anthropology of forced and undocumented migration at the 2017 annual meeting of the American Anthropological Association. Interestingly enough, at the meeting where De Leon won the best book award for his The Land of Open Graves of 2016. By the summer of 2016, the Greek government had installed a total of 69 camps, 50 of which were scattered in the Greek mainland. Without any central authority over them, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees began mapping those sites on a digital platform, really as a form of humanitarian checking, a kind of form of humanitarian watch. That data became the starting point for our project with students from Maryville University and Franklin Marshall College. Some students had never even stepped foot in Greece, but we used that data for introductory class into GIS to see what can be done with it. First, we digitized tabular data provided by the UN and located the camps precisely in GIS, and you see sort of some of the technical work. We then interpreted some general conditions such as overcrowding, comparing population to capacity, and mapping it on the ground. So we can see those invisible refugee camps. Or ethnic diversity between Syrian, Afghani, Iraqi, and Pakistani asylum seekers. While learning GIS, our students became active participants in some form of digital activism that I'm not really sure what I can make of yet, but brought cartographic shape into an invisible problem. Knowing that in the summer of 2016 I would be working with students in Philadelphia's Greek town and on Greek villages, I targeted 3 camps closest to us, to our fieldwork, for some prospecting, and I will talk about the site of Koutsouchiros in greater detail in Thessaly. Rather than focusing on an archaeology of objects, we posited the exploration of the cultural landscape. And trust me, when I came in the summer, I had no idea what to expect. I didn't know whether I could go in a camp. I don't know if I would be arrested. I didn't know. It was really working from the seat of my pants. We approached settlement as an ongoing migration of humans in history. And really, we posited that refugee camps, like a good surface survey archaeology does, refugee camps are just the last episode in a long and ongoing history, and therefore almost kind of deflating the attention, and also turning human lives into sort of special arrangements in a way that is, I think, also a little bit less invasive. This is remote sensing. This is studying from afar. The village of Mandra, next to the camp, was itself a refugee site from 1924. And here what you see is a little early sketch of the camp. As you will see, it's surrounded by mines. It's owned by the military, and the village of Mandra in that very distinctive 1920s planned farmstead that became so common in that resettlement project. The coverage, and here you see where Koutsouchiros is, in case you guys don't know, it's somewhere between Trikala and Larissa. Now, the coverage of the refugee crisis by local news media online also made it possible for me to track the movement of particular refugees on a daily basis through space by watching daily news, like logging on into Sky, which is the only one available to me, or all the local and national networks. So I was really able to reconstruct a complex biography of Koutsouchiros' occupants without ever knowing a single one of them, and their movement through no less than 4 cultural landscapes within 1 year from 2015 and 2016. So I'd like to share that with you just for one moment. I'll try not to take too much time. I'm not sure how familiar you guys are, but this is a technique that is called almost a kind of a biography. How can you approach, it's called almost like a house career. How do you study a person, and you document all the spaces that they've occupied in their lifetime. So using this kind of biographical approach, try to hypothesize what was that continuous experience, and what are the cultural, historical, landscape implications. Okay. So the first thing that happened, as you might remember, is that a group of Syrians were welcomed into the province of Thessaly on March 10th, 2016, when Trikala Castle opened up its gates. This was off-season, so the tourist, there were no tourists there. It was really a really wonderful time of warmest feelings of the crisis, and I'll show you an image from the news as the buses arrive. Now, the interesting thing about Trikala Castle is that first it has this wonderful 1960s reimagining of a medieval past, but it also is located after this towering Ottoman tower, which of course had been blown away in the 40s and rebuilt, that clock tower, which is very comfortably and very proudly a work of an Ottoman mason, and has become really the icon of the city in many ways. So I thought, how interesting, two people sharing the same cultural heritage, the Ottoman cultural heritage, are spending a few nights under this 17th century monument. But no one's talking about it, right? Because, anyway. Most powerful for me was the knowledge, since I am an art historian, I teach this kind of stuff all the time, is that right around the corner from Trikala Castle, right below the castle, is one of Sinan's most important monuments in the Balkans, the Osman Shah Mosque from 1550. And of course, I also knew that Sinan's Kursal Mosque from Aleppo, Syria, a little bit earlier, had just been bombed to pieces in Aleppo in 2004. So if you did sort of this biography of the migrants, you realize their bus, they occupied this space that contained a sample. Here's the image from Google Earth of that mosque, completely destroyed during the Civil War, right? That in Greece, they found the survivor of a cultural heritage that in Syria, shared cultural heritage with Greece, that in Syria has been destroyed. Anyway, March 29th, this was not a permanent situation. The refugees are put back in a bus and they're sent to a military camp that has been prepared by the army, which is in that location, Kutsohiro, right here. Now, the camp is next to a 1960s stone quarry, although in the most fertile part of Greece and the most inhospitable location in that fertile part of Greece, the part that has no farming, although it's surrounded by farming, 1950s army camp, and here you see the tents being built. Now, the thing that we did for as a kind of a digital experiment is to use remote sensing and available satellite images. You can do this on Google Earth, folks, and track the chronology of this landscape from, as you can see, November 10th, 2015, where the site was still a deserted military camp. You might know there's a huge military base in Larissa, making it really convenient to manage this group right here. So this is November 2015. This is April 21st, 2016, when you see all the tents going up. This is May 30th, 2016. You can develop them. You can sort of map tent by tent. And then this amazing thing happened, which made actually the physical field work on the ground possible, which is namely that the United Arab Emirates Red Crescent had donated a source of money to absolve their own guilt for not receiving any refugees, to create slightly more permanent, higher end, essentially trailers. So the refugees had to be evacuated from the camp, sent to other refugee camps. And I don't want to go into detail of what happened when they were sent to other places, when locals were not as friendly, when Golden Dawn burned things down, when they themselves didn't want, but I'll leave that aside and simply return to the site itself. And here you see the Maryville students are using that information to make visible something that is completely off limits, as you can see here. So this is the mapping project. While we were there also, knowing that there would be no refugees, we thought we might explore the site with an archaeological mindset, seeing, okay, what are these monuments? Where does this gate date? Why is there a little shrine? When's the date of that little Christian shrine? Why there are two different walls? Why are there so many torn down buildings from the 1950s? What does it mean to be a decommissioned military base? We didn't make it very far because we realized that, in fact, a member of the Greek poor guy in serving his army duty was, in fact, guarding the site. But we do a lot of kind of video recording so that we can do some of our ground truthing. I don't know if I'll even be able to show you this, and probably shouldn't even bother. But this is becoming kind of our ground check, that now I see this building in this very quick video, and I can match it to the thing on the ground. I won't tell you what happened after they left. When we were actually at the site, this is what was happening to the refugees. They were being kicked out. One of the sites was going to be next to Meteora, if you remember, at the Stratopedo Zyoga Dimitriou, and a grandson of that national hero of 1940 showed up and said, "My father's honor will be eradicated if you bring Syrians here. It's too close to Meteora. That is a tourist site," and so on and so forth. And here's a view of the UAE-funded new trailers. So you see, even within the space of just 6 months, there's an internal chronology. There is an accumulated history. This is not just a camp. This is a very particular place. November 23rd, inauguration of the new Kutsohira Mandra camp, UAE ambassador, president of the Greek Red Cross, you name it, big fanfare. Even Santa Claus showed up on December 2016. So this is an example of essentially a kind of a biography of a place that I think we all need to do for pretty much every one of the 50 camps in some form of in some form of humanitarian watch, if you will. Finally, I want to take you down to the Mandra, the 1924 refugee town, and invite you also to consider, well, how come we don't know very much about that either? So we took the opportunity to begin a kind of very rudimentary study of the camp of 100 years earlier, identify the pattern that, of course, has been disintegrated, but sort of understand the original pattern of the original refugee camp, find the original surviving refugee houses, and actually compare, this once again, very sketchy. What you see in black is a 1924 refugee house, and what you see in the top in the same scale is a 2016 refugee tent, and kind of comparing the statistics. And of course, then you can also say, well, what does the United Nations actually predict? There are documents, right? There's a handbook that talks about what is humanly acceptable and what's not. All right. Whew. That was probably the longest one. Part 2, Leiki project. Whew, back to Greece. Everyone that suffered is almost dead, so we're okay here. It's the summer of 2015, and our American students have joined Greek students from the National Technical University of Athens, the Polytechnio, with Professor Miltiadis Katsaros, that you see here at the top, and then we're sitting right there, and one of his students who's somewhere in the back. We have just completed an archaeological survey of Aegition, near Leiki, a deserted village over the Mornos Reservoir, built in the 1970s to bring water to Athens, 100 kilometers away, and also incidentally destroying the natural and cultural ecosystem of the area. And of course, more recently, there is bauxite mining around the corner. This is a very interesting, pure landscape of national and global kind of interventions along the way. This is why we go there, because it's a good case study for wonderful undergraduates. The survey of Aegition used the physical remains of 80 destroyed houses to answer questions over 5 critical periods. Of course, the economic prosperity of its foundation in 1852, its dependence on remittances from its American migrants that weathered the 1890s, national bankruptcy, and most importantly for the night, as the destruction by the Nazis and imprisonment of its residents. And fourth, its reinhabitation in the 1950s, and then fifth, its ultimate desertion in the 1970s. Our technique is fairly technical, but by now standard and inexpensive. We do not collect any objects. Combining aerial drone with terrestrial photography, we generate a high-resolution virtual 3D model of the site. This one is an actual virtual model, but I'm not going to go into the details, which allows us to query its material culture and its urban organization. You see, for example, the core of the village square, the school, the church, the cemetery, as well as reconstructing how the N curve, or the natural processes of disintegration, work versus the C curve, or the cultural processes of disintegration, by comparing here, for example, drone images over consecutive seasons. Note that the roof collapse of House 65, right, between 2014 and 2015. So we can archaeologically and positivistically determine what is caused by nature and what is caused by humans. This architectural forensics lets us turn a heap of stone, tile, and wood into evidence for complex structural chronologies about a historical refugee experience, both distant enough to be archaeological, but recent enough to be vividly remembered. Let's listen to the words of Dimitris Kafritsas, who was 6 months old when detained in a camp. And of course, Milda's on the right, taking good notes. Quote, "On July 23rd, 1943, the Germans burned the village. They set fire to the whole village. They gathered us and forced us to walk down the mountain to the public road. From there, they drove us in trucks to Brailos, where there's a railroad station, packed us into trains, and took us to Athens, where they kept us in a concentration camp for 10 months. We thought we would end up in Dachau. When the Germans lost the war, we returned. We rebuilt the houses," end of quote. Mr. Kafritsas was what we call today a domestic refugee, or an IDP, an internally displaced person. We all know of the more famous massacres at Kalavrita or at Distomo, 45 kilometers east of Aegition. Quote, "What the Germans did to Greece," end of quote, reported Life magazine in November 22nd, 1944. "Town's death, Germans massacred the people, burned the houses of Distomo," end of quote. Quote again, "In roofless houses, the Greek family Zafiris sets up housekeeping. Along the road, all that remained to the Greeks was the land, the walls of their stone houses, and what they could carry on their backs," end of quote. So how should an archaeologist respond to such crises when they find themselves perfectly trained to deal with exactly such material evidence? Konstantin Doxiadis responded to the crisis by clandestine documentation. As you all know, an urban planner of Athens before the war, he deployed a network of architects to record architectural destruction as a form of resistance. In 1947, he presented this evidence in a conference at San Francisco, and a pamphlet called Destruction of Towns and Villages in Greece. During the Nuremberg trials, Greece could prove the destruction of 1,600 villages, 1/4 of its total stock of 6,500 inhabited villages. This is why Greek villages look so weird. This is why they don't look like, I don't know, Florence. Aegetion provides, in his beautiful infographic, Doxiadis represents Greece's post-war homelessness at 18%. But as we know, seeking reparations from Germany was discouraged. This is what we did after the First World War, and we know what happened. So things were kind of, people moved on into the post-war economic sort of bliss and development, especially since everybody ended up in Athens anyway. Aegetion provides a unique glimpse into the archaeology of displacement, destruction, and reoccupation in 3 dimensions. We have virtual images for each one of these houses. One can virtually examine each house and sequence its chronology. For example, you can see that the coins are missing, right? The coins of that wall. And if you're an architectural historian, you know the last thing that falls are the corners, the strongest part of the construction. So this shows an intentional agency of someone of the squatters after the destruction of the village, salvaging the rocks from one house to use in the one they're building in the next house. So we know when people returned from the concentration camp in Athens, they lived in the apotheques for a few years, and they slowly rebuilt their houses without any resources, and the usual story. We also mapped we also sort of we sort of, after virtually examining each house, we also create an inventory of objects that are found in situ or collected by the very active locals at the so-called folklore museum, which of course, like most of those museums in Greece, doesn't have a budget, doesn't have a guard. It's just a very important room that contains laurafika things. So, for example, you have this milk jug that you see here at the museum, or a second one on the left in situ in one of the house, or the one on the right that was used as a funerary monument. Things like a record player, a singer sewing machine. I'm not going to go through this. I think we're running out of time. But although we're working on this book now, as sort of the archaeology of destruction, if you will. You can see all of our data is already online. The top one is an inventory of all of our houses. The second one is a Omeka site of all of our 136 objects. And the third one is the site where we have all our 3D models, where we can sort of spin through the houses. And if you want, you can put the objects back in the house. Be my guest. The data is all there for you. Okay, now let's return for a second to Mr. Kafritsas. He continues, quote, "My house belonged to someone else. Oh, wait a minute. My father bought it from a man who went to America 3 times in order to build it. His name is marked on the date stone. Look, up there. Iota Mi, 1915, M. 4 Boviatsis," end of quote. 4 other date stones, including a 1909 donor inscription for the schoolhouse, you see here, cross-listed with the oral history, helps track our story to Ellis Island and identify the migrants that went to the United States in the teens as they entered the port of New York, where their declared destination is precisely all 4 of them that you see here at 682 Water Street, Milwaukee, where we can actually find and we can sort of connect. So you see things, I hope I'm not making this up. I think there is a multi-temporal migrant landscape that we need to sort of somehow, and I'm not doing a very good job, synthesize or at least bring into conversation. There's also, of course, Mr. Kafritsas' brother, who was actually the German truck ran over his leg. He became crippled, and the British had a program for disabled orphans and took him to Derby, England, where he lives now. So these threads sort of continue as sort of refugee biographies and landscapes. All right, so the next 2 parts, I think I'm going to have to do kind of quickly because I don't want to keep you here all night as much as I wish to, because this is the greatest group of scholars that I can have hostage for 3 hours. Anyways, I want to move back now to our third period, which is the best-known refugee crisis, where 1/4 of the Greek population was increased through Asia Minor, from Asia Minor refugees. This image that I'm sure you've seen 100 million times actually comes from National Geographic, And it actually shows the situation in the Athenian Agora before 1932, before the excavations. And as we know from Niki Saka and many other scholars, the Athenian Agora had become a refugee site, and one of the main reasons why the Greek government wrote it into law that the Americans should excavate it is to make sure that it doesn't remain a refugee site. Archaeology, national archaeology, is the opposite of having refugees. So in some way, we have this sort of really interesting juxtaposition. What we see also here, after 1932, is the process itself of slum clearing. I won't get into the politics of this, and one very important thing I should note is, from my point of view, whether you believe Yannis Hamilakis or Niki Saka, whether you put the blame more on the Greeks or the Americans, that's not so much my interest. What I think is absolutely powerful is that because it was an archaeological excavation, the photographic record of this neighborhood is amazing. And Sylvie Dumont has this amazing book that records, I hope soon in print, that records every corner of this neighborhood in Plaka. Anyway, so here's slum clearing. The Art and Archaeology Journal magazine published at Princeton in 1931, an image of that same street looking up to the Acropolis. 2 residents of the Agora area. One wishes to leave the old home, one does not. But let's move this on target. Forget about poor Greeks. Let's look at refugee Greeks. And I want to thank the Agora archives in this case for having precisely documented 2 refugee sites in the site of the Agora. Sylvie has photographs that we could really kind of visually excavate, see precisely what doorknob is placed over what other doorknob. Sylvie also has documents where the refugees are going to Mr. Adosiadis and begging them to hand them over parts of the buildings as they're being torn down so they can build into their parangoupolis that you see here. This one is around the Physion that lasted for many years. And you know these parangoupolis lasted on the Pnik site through the 1960s. But there's very little documentation of them because they're sites of embarrassment, shame, low class. I won't get into the urban issues. So what is the American response? Remember, we have the American and the British archaeological schools that have built-in a kind of Protestant humanitarian DNA. I want to strike out. I want to highlight, as horrible as David Robinson may have been as a person, that his excavations at Olynthus from 1932 not only hired 300 refugees. The site lived in a refugee settlement, and moreover, the assistant director was himself a refugee. And here you see a picture from the Olynthus publications that you probably guys go through to find this wonderful late classical mosaics and what have you. And here's a record of that precise refugee settlement, built, of course, by the Refugee Resettlement Commission, that has at least one American in the border in a board of 4, because at that point, Americans, because of the Red Cross, because of Near East Relief, were the only nationality that had any experience in international humanitarianism, right? Near East Relief, if you remember, got started in the Armenian genocide and kind of retooled itself to deal with the Greek refugee crisis. Among its strategies among the strategies of the Near East Relief was to create these, hire refugee women to build textiles and chairs and sell it with ambitions of selling internationally. Priscilla Capps, the daughter of Edward Capps, the director of the managing committee of the American School, was the woman who actually sat at the shop and sold the stuff. And this is why you find the refugee-made artifacts in every private collection of any American archaeologist. Priscilla Capps was good friends with Alison France, all the 1920s great folks. Once she married and moved to Boston, she donated her study collection to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. So if you want to find the models for refugee craft intervention, not a bad place to go see it in Boston, right? Here you see an image that Artemis Leondis sent me from the University of Michigan that shows that Near East Relief refugee workshop in Athens as they produce those textiles for export. And here's a Near East Relief refugee doll that I know Natalia and Jack Davis are very much interested in, which is the object that the refugees made to sell internationally. It is such an object that I got for our little exhibition in Lancaster at the Phillips Museum, and you see I've placed her right next to the contemporary crafts, and you can see the pictures, so that to argue of this sort of interesting continuity of strategies of managing fundraising, but at the same time integrating material culture. But let me move on. We also have the artists, the bohemians. We all know of Isadora Duncan wearing funny clothes, but we never think of her brother, Raymond, who ended up staying in Greece, marrying Penelope Sikelianos, going with her up to the Balkan refugee camps after the Balkan Wars to help them create self-sufficient textile production. In fact, Penelope got sick and died as a result of this. His sister thought he was crazy. She didn't want to have anything to do with it. She moved on in her career, but Duncan stuck it out. Similarly, from the British school, Piet de Jong, everybody knows him, the most incredible mechanikos, artist, architect, worked in Crete, worked with the Athenian Agora. The reason why he ended up in Greece was to work with the British landscape architect to rebuild the Thessaloniki after the Great Fire, but more importantly, to work with a Macedonian relief group that was building new towns destroyed by the Balkan Wars. Here you see, Zachos, the great Greek architect from the Polytechnion, and Mawson, the British landscape architect for whom Piet de Jong came to work with. And among other things, Piet de Jong, in fact, designed refugee settlements. Ormanli or Jumaya are products, works of architecture that Piet de Jong designed. And I had the privilege of interviewing one of the occupants of that house, hearing about what it would have been like for a Greek family that had their entire city completely bombed out, be shipped somewhere else, have a British architect redesign, a fancy new town, and then be almost arbitrarily assigned the houses in which they would live in, and also finding oddities about the public and private usage of this sort of idealized house. But let's move on. The next part, which will be, 3 minutes, I'll speed this through, is to return back to the origins of that humanitarian tradition that the American school carries on and the British carry on in the 1920s. And of course, there's issues of cultural capital here, and I know many have addressed this, that by volunteering, by being good to the Greek government, you get permits like the Athenian Agora. So, we can be cynical if we want to, that there's a kind of, there could be a kind of, cultural agenda. But I think fundamentally, if you look at it through and through, there is a dimension of humanitarianism that sort of transcends that politicking that we might blame the imperialist Americans for in that first era of economic aggressiveness, right? After all, the New York banks are the ones that are lending money to both the German side and the French side during the First World War, right? And they're the ones that want the money back, which causes Germany to go into an economic crisis, which leads to the Second War. So no way do I say that Americans are the happy, innocent Protestants that just want to do good things. And so if we're going to talk about a national refugee crisis, why not start from 1821, where not only do we have the beginnings of refugee crisis for our country, but we have the beginnings of Romanticism. We have Delacroix's massacre at Chios that caused an incredible refugee crisis that was managed in other refugee settlements, 12 of them, in fact, as Greek historians have documented throughout the country. If you go to Brown University, you'll find that the American flagpole has a little Doric base to it that says, a gift to Samuel Howe, the greatest Philhellene, for essentially donating his life to the Greek cause. Samuel Howe, if you remember, is the Boston medical assistant in the war who comes to Greece as part of that. Remember that Philadelphia, the Episcopal Church had decided in 1829 that it's going to try its hand to missionary work, and not to the Native Americans further west, right, as other Methodists are doing. I mean, this is really important. The Episcopal Church was the Anglican Church. You had a problem after the American Civil War. It took the church a couple of decades to decide what would be their new identity. And it wasn't until 1829 that they got their foot into missionary work, which is mandatory in some sense for 19th century Protestantism. And they decided in 1829 that missionary work is going to happen in Greece first, and then to the American West. Samuel Howe is one of the few members that actually goes there. As I said, he contributes to he's good friends with Kapodistrias. Unfortunately, Kapodistrias gets assassinated. He doesn't get his support anymore, but he assists in the sort of greatest Greek humanitarian project, the Greek orphanage in Aegina, which looked something like this. When it was first built, they had crafts for women to create objects that they could then sell, because this mechanism had to be economically self-sufficient. It only lasted for about a decade before it was turned into a prison. And you can see here the plan of the prison. Of course, a famous prison where famous people got imprisoned, a great site to go visit. But ultimately, it's one of these sort of, without, in some sense, that sort of little push of the Protestant humanitarian side, it's really easy to turn a refugee camp into a prison. It's a very fine line, if you think of it in many ways. Samuel Howe also incredibly goes to, while he's at Egina, he's reporting on where the refugees are living in, including turning these very important graves into houses right by the Temple of Apollo, I think, by the port. In fact, he gets accused of excavating illegally that site in order to build the Aeginas port, which he does because he thinks it's very important to protect the... and he reports as almost like a social scientist, what are the pros and cons of living in an ancient grave versus living in a tent? Finally, we know of the project in Nafplion. This is the refugee camp of Pronia, fueled by the Greek government. Unfortunately, because of the redesigning of Nafplion a couple decades later, that refugee settlement gets rebuilt, looking something like this. But we can reconstruct it from early drawings and see what did a refugee settlement look like. Now let's go back to Howe very quickly and show by going through his journals to see what were the activities that he had to carry out to create the foundation of Washingtonia, and conclude with why Washingtonia has disappeared. The first thing that he does is that he finds the ruined palace of the Bay in Corinth, and he sends up tents there from which he can mastermind the design of a much more permanent camp. Henry Robinson, another Robinson, excavated that site, the Baths of Aphrodite, in 1960. Here's what that would have looked like a little bit later. So in a letter to Horace Mann, Samuel Howe says, I applied to the government and obtained a large tract of land upon the Isthmus of Corinth, where I found a colony of exiles, people wandering around from the war. We put up cottages, procured seed, cattle, etc. Flourishing village was laid. Capodistria had encouraged me in the plan of the colony and made some promises to help. The evidence is here. We have, although Americans have been working in that site for the last, for many years, at this point we haven't quite surely identified where that site is. Tim Gregory, who's in the back, and Lita, I think, who are the experts on this territory, have a very good idea where it is. Nothing is there. Over a dinner with Tom Galland last summer, we had this crazy idea. Well, why don't we just find it and excavate it? Like, what the heck, right? This is the beginnings of humanitarianism. So the first thing we need to do is to go through the 4 possible sites. One theory is that it's actually on the village of Hexamelia. Second theory, it's by the train station, those of you that know Corinth. Third idea, that it's closer to Cenchreae and the quarries. And fourth idea, that it's actually closer to the southeast village to the right. But we can sort this out. It's also positive that in Corinth it is that, although not quite fully published, that we have the best excavations of 19th century farmsteads. And this is actually my notebook from 1990, when I get to excavate some dead 19th century people, including their buttons and their uniforms. Okay. 5 minutes. Do I have your patience for 5 minutes? I'm done. I'm done with my case studies, but I do want to get you really excited about the future prospects. So in 1832, Edward Knoll and Frederick von Fellenberg ventured to Greece. They were both graduates of Hofwil, Switzerland, a radical experiment in education that sought, quote, to bring rich and poor people together through education and mutual work. Wow, it sounds like the 1830s arts and crafts movement, but 30 years earlier. Emmanuel, the son of Hofwil's founder, and Noel, supported by Lady Byron, chose Akhmetaga, Euboea, as the site of their new school, right? Like Kapodistrias Agricultural School in Tiryns, like the Hills School for Girls in the right next to the Tower of the Winds. In order for the school to be self-sufficient, it had to operate as a revenue-generating farm, so including lumber and later mining, because that was one of the important things, but both of Howe and Bedell and everybody else. Humanitarianism is not a handout. It's not giving something some cash. It's creating the possibility for self-sufficiency so you can walk out and the settlement will take care of itself. So in order for the school, so the project of the school never got off the ground. It's kind of remote in Ubia to get your students out there. But the Noels continued with land management and innovations through the course of the 19th century. The tumultuous life of the estate in the 19th century was highlighted by horrendous murder in 1855 that Tom actually has written about, the lesser-known Leiki murders. Notes on now the important thing about this site, here's the school, an image of the school up in Switzerland, the model. Here's another view of Irene Knoll and Philip Baker. So Philip Baker married Irene in 1915. Baker, very importantly, had worked with Nansen in the exchange of populations between Greece and Turkey, and was engaged with the most progressive declarations of human rights. After all, he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1959 for his work on disarmament. So Irene and Philip Knoll Baker were progressive and supportive of the refugee cause. And in 1925, the government decided to expropriate part of the estate to create a refugee settlement that was renamed the village of Prokopi. Here's a view of the estate. I've had the great honor to start looking at the Knoll Baker archives and to just meet Frank Knoll Baker a few minutes ago. And I look forward to visiting Prokopi tomorrow for the first time. So I don't have anything conclusive to say. However, I must say I am because the estate through 2 centuries was managed long distance. There was a caretaker on site that wrote every 10 days, every 2 weeks, a letter to England, recording in great detail every aspect of the farm, including the crisis of the refugees, where you can see, not in black and white, but in nuance, the intense conflicts of what happens when someone tells you that part of your land, you don't know how much, you don't know how many, will be expropriated. So I want to share for you some small jewels of that archive. Letter of 18th of March 1925 by the caretaker, written to Irene in England. I see 15 to 20, this is of course in wonderful Greek, very vernacular, says something like, I see 15 to 20 refugees coming and they ask me housing. I told them, Παιδιά μου, I don't have houses, but someone told us you have houses, and they would not leave. They wanted to sneak inside the storage spaces. So despite the goodwill, right, there were things on the ground that had to be resolved. A letter to Mr. Milonas by Irene from September 1924. Some cause for concern about what does it mean to expropriate. Don't expropriate the forest. That is a disaster in terms of ecological management. And she describes in detail the structure of the estate. The arable land is now cultivated by me and my colleague, but the fields might be redivided and given up to 10 or at the very most 15 more families. It would be quite impossible for more families to live upon Ahmed Aga estate, as there simply is no more room and for them to cultivate anything. The current proposal is that the refugees should cut down the remaining quarter of unburned forest using the timber for making huts, and that they should then try to convert the rest of the forest land to fields. Any of the proper forest authorities will tell you that this will not only ruin the forest for no purpose, as it would be impossible to convert this land into fields for corn or anything else. So ultimately, 550 stremata out of a total of 1980 were given to the refugees on the left bank of the river, while the right bank was still reserved for the Ahmed Aga locals. Another letter. In conversation with Mr. Karagiannis, I supported the above contention by telling him, a few years later, something that it was kind of a surprise to find, that even after the Cappadocian, famously the big church and all the shrines and all that stuff, even 4 years later, we read, I know it's hard to read, in conversation with Mr. Karagiannis, I supported the above contention by telling him, there are now at Ahmed Aga refugees who have just moved in from Thebes. So that's another group we didn't know about, who at Thebes paid an annual rent of 350 drachmas per strema for land no better than that for which Mr. Karagiannis and Mr. Papanastasiou offered 300 drachmas. Most touching is a letter from December 15th, 1940, soon after the war, and you can see that letter that was sent to England was examined by the Secret Service, but it was also examined by the Greek Elogokrysia, at a time of war. This is a letter that essentially, with incredible language, describes what it was like to be at Ahmed Agha and be sitting on the radio and listening to Noel Baker on the radio addressing the globe and understanding this is someone that you know quite closely. I'm not going to go through it, but finally, the house was destroyed during the war. Here's an image from it before. Here's what it looked like after the war. But we have this wonderful inventory of all of the house contents. This is an archaeologist's dream. At the very bottom, you might see at the lower right here, buildings, destruction by fire, a 15-room house, together with contents, furniture, library, 1,500 books, estate and family archives, etc. On June 8, 1947, we have a letter that describes the beginning of the rebuilding of the house, that even mentions the origin of the Masons from the village of Politica. On April 24, 1949, we have some evidence of what's happening during the Greek Civil War. I quote very briefly, "They don't seem to be interested in supporting the army. Refugees meet the partisans, but they don't betray them. We must pass all these with calm." Conclusion. The current refugee crisis in Greece is only the latest episode in a continuing movement of forced migration through the Greek landscape. Dispersed throughout the countryside and tightly policed by the army, today's camps present challenges in documenting a material landscape of suffering, employing techniques developed by archaeologists of the contemporary world, and those, by the way, I didn't bother to show you, have been applied by Andrew Myers and Guantanamo Bay. Strictly from remote sensing, Andrew Myers has recorded the development of the off-site Guantanamo Bay complex, published in legitimate archaeological journals. Right? We develop a disciplinary response to camps as an increasingly dominant mode of housing in the 21st century, kind of naturalizing them along with all other kinds of ephemeral housing. Greece offers a unique laboratory to investigate the long history of refugee housing. More than any other European country, it has continuously confronted a crisis of refugees from its inception as a nation-state. I have counted about 3,000 refugee settlements. How many have we really studied or excavated? We have studied the urban ones, amazing work in the 70s, noting that the site of Coquignan and the histories of the occupants and how they cramped themselves in, politics, but none of the rural landscapes that seem to just sort of disappeared, some of them into the ground. The National Archaeological Service and the foreign schools have played significant roles, both positive and negative, in managing the multiple refugee crises, either using archaeology to get rid of the refugees in this particular place or using archaeology to work with refugees in a particular place. A systematic new field of refugee archaeology must overcome Greece's traditional resistance to the excavation of modern sites. I mean, something has to, right? We have to excavate the sites of trauma, internment camps, refugee camps, political prisoner camps, or mass burials. Using the most recent refugee crisis as a starting point, I hope that I've highlighted an ongoing research on the archaeology of modern displacement during these various periods, and I hope that with the missionaries' zeal, I hope that I've converted you to giving some thought into a positive, materialist investigation of this rich landscape. Thank you.